The return of a hero, a journey of forgiveness, family and new beginnings. Ethan Walker had spent the last 10 years learning how to say goodbye. As a Navy senior chief, he'd seen the world from the deck of an aircraft carrier, watched sunsets over distant oceans, and fought battles in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. He had buried friends, worn medals he never asked for, and learned that in war, you don't have the luxury of looking back. But now, sitting in a cramped military transport on his way home to Charleston, South Carolina, Ethan realized something terrifying. He had no idea how to say hello again. The call had come 2 days ago. His younger sister, Emily, her voice shaking, struggling to get the words out. "It's Mom, Ethan, the cancer is back. Doctors say she doesn't have much time." The sentence hit him like a bullet. Margaret Walker had always been a strong woman. When Ethan's father died in a car accident when he was just 12, she had worked 2 jobs to keep their small house. She never asked for help, never showed weakness, never let her children feel how hard it was to raise them alone. And yet, when he turned 18, Ethan had left. At the time, the Navy felt like an escape, a way out of a life that felt too small, too predictable. He told himself he'd come back after a few years. But deployments turned into longer deployments. Holidays were spent overseas. Years passed, and somehow his mother became just a voice on the phone, a voice that always told him she was fine, even when she wasn't. And now there were no more years left. The plane touched down, and as Ethan stepped off, the humid South Carolina air wrapped around him like an old memory. He had been in deserts, on frozen seas, in jungles, but nothing felt as foreign as being back in his own hometown. Emily was waiting at the gate. She was 28 now, but still had the same fierce determination in her eyes that she'd had as a kid. She had been the one who stayed, the one who took care of their mother while Ethan was halfway across the world. "You look tired," she said, her arms crossing over her chest. "I am," Ethan admitted. They didn't hug. Not at first. There was too much space between them, years of distance, words left unsaid, phone calls ignored. But then, as if something inside her cracked, Emily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. And Ethan, the man who had survived wars, who had carried fallen comrades, who had spent a decade pretending he was stronger than his past, broke. For the first time in years, he let himself feel it. The regret, the guilt, the weight of everything he had left behind. And as his sister held him, he realized something. This was the hardest homecoming of his life. The car ride to the hospital was quiet. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the streets of Charleston, a city he barely recognized anymore. The old diners he used to visit were gone, replaced by modern cafes. The movie theater where he had taken his first girlfriend was now an office building. Even the air smelled different, saltier, heavier, filled with something he couldn't quite name. But the biggest change wasn't the city, it was him. Emily drove with both hands gripping the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She had barely spoken since they left the airport, but Ethan could feel the tension in the air. Finally, she broke the silence. "You didn't even tell me you were coming." Ethan glanced at her. "I booked the first flight I could. Didn't think I needed to announce it. Maybe not to me, but to Mom." "Yeah, you should have." The words hit him harder than he expected. "She doesn't know I'm here." Emily shook her head. "No. She stopped expecting you a long time ago." Ethan opened his mouth to say something, to defend himself, to explain, to tell her how much he had wanted to be here sooner. But what excuse could possibly be good enough? Instead, he said nothing. The hospital appeared in the distance, a tall, sterile building with massive glass windows reflecting the early evening sky. As Emily pulled into the parking lot, Ethan's hands clenched into fists. This was it, the moment he had been dreading since the phone call, the moment he had spent years avoiding. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and faded hope. Ethan followed Emily through the hallways, his boots heavy against the polished tile floor. The place was quiet, except for the occasional beep of a heart monitor and the soft murmurs of nurses moving through the corridors. Room 417. Emily stopped in front of the door and turned to face him. "She's weaker than you remember." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Emily took a deep breath, then pushed the door open. The sight nearly broke him. His mother, Margaret Walker, the strongest woman he had ever known, was lying in bed, barely more than a shadow of the person he remembered. Her once vibrant hair was thin and grey, her skin pale against the white hospital sheets. But when she opened her eyes and saw him standing in the doorway, something flickered in her expression. Not shock, not anger, just sadness, and something even worse. Resignation. "Ethan." His name barely left her lips, but it carried everything. Ethan stepped forward, but suddenly, he didn't know what to do with his hands, didn't know how to speak, didn't know how to close the distance between them. 10 years of absence had built an invisible wall between them, and now, standing in front of her, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to tear it down. "Hey, Mom." Margaret's lips curved into the smallest smile. "I must be dying if you finally came home." The words were meant to be a joke, but they sliced through him like a blade. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to move closer. He took her frail hand in his, guilt pressing down on him like a weight he could no longer ignore. "I should have come sooner." Margaret's fingers curled around his weakly. "Yes, you should have." Ethan let out a shaky breath, nodding. No excuses, no explanations. Just the truth. For the first time in years, he was home. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he deserved to be. The hospital room felt smaller than it should have. Ethan sat beside his mother's bed, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. The machines beeped softly, their rhythm unsettlingly steady, as if mocking the reality of the situation. Margaret Walker was dying, and no amount of high-tech hospital equipment could stop it. Emily sat in the chair by the window, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the fading light outside. The silence between them was thick, filled with years of unspoken words, with the weight of everything Ethan should have done differently. Finally, Margaret's voice broke the quiet. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Ethan turned to her, his jaw tightening. "I should have come back sooner." His mother studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes, the same shade as his, tired but still sharp. "Why didn't you?" Ethan exhaled slowly. Where did he even begin? How did he explain that he had spent 10 years telling himself he was too busy, too far away, too needed elsewhere? That every deployment, every mission, every new assignment had been another excuse not to face what he had left behind? How did he tell her that it was easier to be thousands of miles away in the middle of a war zone than to sit in this room and face the fact that he had failed her? I don't know. It was a lie. And she knew it. Margaret's gaze softened. "You always were a terrible liar." Ethan let out a weak chuckle, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, guess some things don't change." His mother's fingers, thin and frail, reached out and rested lightly on his hand. "You were always running, Ethan, even as a boy. Always looking for the next thing, always afraid to stand still." He swallowed hard. "I thought I had more time." Margaret smiled sadly. "We all do." Emily, who had remained silent until now, let out a bitter laugh. "Time, that's rich, coming from you, Ethan." He turned to look at her, surprised by the sharpness in her voice. "Emily!" "No." She sat up, her eyes flashing with something between anger and exhaustion. "Do you have any idea how many times I sat in this hospital, hoping you'd call? How many times Mom told me, 'Ethan's busy, Ethan's overseas, Ethan's doing important things,' like what we were going through wasn't important." Ethan's stomach twisted. "I didn't know." Emily shook her head, laughing bitterly again. "You didn't ask." Silence fell over the room. His mother closed her eyes, her breathing slow and uneven. Ethan could see how much effort it took for her to stay awake, to be present in this moment. "Emily." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not now." Emily clenched her jaw and turned away, pressing her fingers against her forehead as if trying to hold back everything she wanted to say. Ethan looked down at their mother's hand in his, the weight of years lost pressing down on him. There was no fixing this, there was only now, and it wasn't enough. Ethan barely slept that night. After hours at the hospital, he had finally convinced Emily to go home and rest. She'd been reluctant at first, but exhaustion eventually won, and she left with a muttered warning. "Don't disappear again." Ethan promised he wouldn't. And for the first time in years, he intended to keep his word, but sleep never came. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed in his childhood home, staring at the framed photographs on the nightstand. Dust had gathered along the edges, and he wondered how long they had been sitting there, untouched. One of them was from his Navy graduation. His mother and Emily stood beside him, smiling, proud. Ethan could still remember the day. Margaret had held onto his arm so tightly, as if afraid that letting go meant losing him forever. And in a way, she had. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. He had spent years outrunning his past, believing that as long as he kept moving, the consequences of his choices couldn't catch up. Now, they had, and they weren't letting go. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the hospital before sunrise. Margaret was awake but weaker than the day before. She smiled when she saw him, but it was a fragile thing, more memory than reality. "You didn't have to come this early." Ethan pulled a chair closer to her bed. "Didn't feel like sleeping." Margaret studied him for a long moment. "War does that to you?" Ethan stiffened slightly. "Yeah," she sighed, shifting slightly against the pillows. "I used to pray every night that you'd come home safe. And when you did, I'd pray that you'd finally come home for good." Ethan swallowed hard. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Margaret gave him a tired smile. "I know." A pause. Then, softer. "But Ethan, were you?" The question cut deep. Ethan had spent years convincing himself that his duty to his country justified everything. The missed holidays, the unanswered calls, the distance. But now, sitting in this hospital room, watching his mother fade before his eyes, he wasn't so sure anymore. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "I don't know." Margaret reached for his hand. "Then figure it out, before it's too late." Ethan squeezed her fingers gently. "I'm here now." She smiled, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him she knew the truth. Sometimes, now isn't enough. The days blurred together. Ethan spent every waking hour at the hospital, watching helplessly as his mother's strength faded. The woman who had once been a force of nature, who had raised 2 kids alone, who had never let life break her, was now too weak to sit up without assistance. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Emily came and went, always exhausted, always distant. The resentment between them lingered like a storm cloud, but neither of them had the energy to confront it. Not now. Not while their mother was still breathing. One night, Margaret stirred awake after hours of silence. Ethan was by her side, flipping through an old book she used to read to them as kids. "Ethan." He set the book down immediately. "Yeah, Mom." She hesitated for a moment, then reached for his hand. Her grip was weak, barely there, but he held on to it anyway. "I need you to promise me something." Ethan leaned in. "Anything." Her tired eyes met his. "Take care of Emily." The words hit him harder than he expected. "Mom." "She took care of me when you couldn't. She carried all of this alone. She's strong, but she's tired, Ethan. She's been tired for a long time." Ethan swallowed hard, guilt settling deep in his chest. Margaret gave him a small, knowing smile. "She won't make it easy on you." Ethan let out a short laugh. "Yeah, I figured." His mother's smile faded and her eyes drifted closed again. "Don't wait too long." Ethan sat there, holding her fragile hand in both of his, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. She was right. He had already wasted too much time, and time was running out. Margaret Walker passed away at 3:42 a.m. on a quiet Wednesday morning. Ethan was there. He hadn't slept. He had sat by her side, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, counting each breath, afraid that at any moment it would be her last. And then it was. One moment, she was there. The next, she wasn't. The machines didn't scream. There was no dramatic final gasp, no poetic last words, just a single breath that never came again. Ethan sat frozen, staring at her still face, his mother's hand still in his. It didn't feel real. How could she be gone? How could this woman who had survived raising 2 kids alone, who had endured every hardship life threw at her, just stop existing? A nurse came in, checked for a pulse, and gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'm so sorry." Ethan barely registered the words. Emily arrived minutes later. She rushed into the room, her hair a mess, her breath uneven, eyes wild with the desperate hope that maybe it wasn't true. But when she saw Ethan's face, she knew. She stopped in the doorway, her lips parting, her fingers trembling as she gripped the doorframe. "No!" Ethan stood, but before he could say anything, Emily broke. "You should have called me." Her voice cracked. "I should have been here. I didn't." "Of course you didn't." She turned away, pressing her hands against her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ethan wanted to comfort her, to say something, anything, but what could he say? That he was sorry, that he wished things had been different, that he had spent his entire life running from this moment, and now that it had come, he didn't know how to live with it. Nothing would be enough. So he stayed silent, and for the second time that night, he lost someone he loved, was set for Saturday morning. Emily took charge of the arrangements. She picked out the casket, spoke to the funeral home, coordinated with the church. She did it all with a cold efficiency that unsettled Ethan, like this was just another task to check off a list. But he knew better. This wasn't just strength, it was survival. Emily had spent years preparing for this moment, whether she realized it or not. She had been the one taking their mother to appointments, sitting through test results, listening to doctors explain things Ethan should have been there to hear. And now she was handling it, the way she always had, the way Ethan hadn't. The house felt different without their mother in it. It was quiet but not peaceful. Every room carried her presence. The smell of her perfume still lingered in the air. Her slippers sat by the door as if she might come back for them. A half-finished crossword puzzle rested on the kitchen table. Ethan walked through each room slowly, his fingers trailing along the furniture, the pictures on the walls. He stopped in front of a framed photograph of their mother holding both of them as kids. He looked so young, so certain that the world would always be the way it was in that moment. He barely heard Emily come in behind him. She kept everything the same. Her voice was quiet, tired. Ethan nodded. "Yeah." Emily crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I used to tell her she should get rid of some of this stuff. Said she was living in the past." Ethan turned to look at her. "Maybe she just didn't want to let go." Emily scoffed. "Or maybe she was waiting for you to come back." The words hit like a knife to the gut. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. I know you're angry." "Angry?" She let out a sharp laugh. "Ethan, I stopped being angry years ago. Now I'm just tired." He stared at her, unsure of what to say. Emily shook her head. "You get to come back and be the grieving son. You get to sit at her bedside at the last minute and feel sorry for yourself. But where the hell were you when it actually mattered?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "I was gone." Silence. The truth settled heavy between them. Emily sighed, rubbing her temple. "I'm not doing this with you right now. The funeral's in 2 days. Just try not to disappear before then." She turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the hallway, staring at a version of himself in a photograph that no longer existed. Saturday came faster than Ethan was ready for. The church was filled with people who had known Margaret Walker long before Ethan had ever thought about leaving. Old neighbors, childhood friends, women from her book club, the cashier from the grocery store who always bagged her produce just the way she liked it. And then there was Ethan, the son who left. He sat in the front pew, hands clasped together, staring at the polished mahogany casket. It didn't feel real. He kept waiting for his mother to walk through the doors, to scold everyone for making such a big fuss over her. But that moment never came. Emily sat beside him, stiff and unreadable. She hadn't spoken to him since their argument 2 days ago. Not that he blamed her. When the service began, people stood to speak about Margaret. How kind she was, how strong, how she never once complained, even when life gave her every reason to. Ethan listened, but every word felt like a knife to the chest, because all of these people, strangers, acquaintances, had known more about his mother's final years than he had. Finally, the pastor looked toward the front pew. "Would anyone from the family like to say a few words?" Ethan's heart pounded. This was it, the moment to stand up and tell everyone what a wonderful mother she was, to explain how much he loved her, how much he regretted not being there. But he couldn't move. He couldn't stand in front of these people and pretend like he had earned the right to speak. Emily, however, did. She rose slowly, walked to the pulpit, and took a steady breath. "My mother was the strongest woman I've ever known." Her voice didn't waver. She spoke about Margaret's sacrifices, her resilience, the way she had made a broken life still feel whole. She didn't mention Ethan, not once, and as he sat there, his chest tightening, he realized something. She hadn't left him out to punish him. She had left him out because he had already done that to himself. Ethan barely remembered the rest of the funeral. He shook hands with people he hadn't seen in years, nodded as they told him how sorry they were, how proud his mother had been of him. He wanted to believe them, but all he could hear was Emily's speech. Not a single mention of him. It shouldn't have hurt, but it did. After the burial, people slowly began to leave, murmuring their condolences one last time before disappearing into their cars. Eventually, it was just Ethan and Emily standing side by side in front of their mother's grave. The silence between them stretched. Ethan cleared his throat. "You gave a good speech." Emily didn't respond right away. She just kept staring at the headstone, her arms wrapped around herself as the wind picked up. Finally, she exhaled sharply. "I didn't know what to say about you." Ethan swallowed hard. "That obvious, huh?" Emily let out a humorless laugh. "It wasn't intentional. I didn't sit down and decide to leave you out. But when I was writing it, I kept trying to remember moments of you and Mom together, and there just weren't enough." Ethan looked down, his hands tightening into fists. "I know I wasn't here, Em." "Yeah," she muttered, shaking her head. "I know you know, but that doesn't change anything." Ethan hesitated, then turned to face her fully. "I can't fix the past. I wish to God I could, but I can't. I can't undo the years I missed, and I can't bring her back." Emily's jaw clenched, but she didn't speak. Ethan continued, "But I'm still your brother, and I'm still here." Emily finally looked at him, her eyes glassy but unreadable. "Are you?" The words hit like a hammer. She turned and started walking toward her car. Ethan stood there watching her go, knowing that this was it, his last chance to fix what was left of his family. And for the first time in his life, he refused to let someone walk away from him. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved, his boots crunching against the gravel, closing the distance between him and Emily before she could reach her car. "Wait." She stopped but didn't turn around. Ethan took a breath, steadying himself. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness." That made her turn, Her expression was unreadable, arms still crossed, shoulders stiff. "So why are you here?" Ethan exhaled, his hands on his hips. "Because I don't want to lose you too." Emily let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "You lost me a long time ago, Ethan." The words stung, but he didn't back down. "Maybe, but I don't want that to be the end of it." Emily's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping her car keys so tightly they might break the skin. "You were gone for 10 years. Do you have any idea what that was like? Watching Mom get sick over and over again, sitting in hospital rooms alone, knowing you were somewhere out there but never knowing when or if you'd come back." Ethan opened his mouth, but she wasn't done. "You got to leave. You got to live a whole other life while I was here, picking up the pieces, pretending like it didn't hurt that my only brother barely even felt like family anymore." Ethan's chest tightened. "I know, and I hate myself for it." Emily blinked, her lips pressing together. Good. Silence. She turned back to her car, but this time Ethan didn't stop her, because she was right. And for the first time in his life, he had to accept that some wounds don't heal overnight. Some wounds take time, and this time he wasn't gonna run. Ethan didn't leave. For the first time in years, he stayed. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier. His mother's presence was everywhere, but she wasn't there. The chair she used to sit in, the books she never finished reading, the scent of her perfume still faint in her bedroom. Everything was exactly the same, and yet nothing was. Emily didn't speak to him for 3 days. She stayed at her apartment across town, only stopping by the house briefly to sort through paperwork, make phone calls, handle the last of their mother's affairs. She moved with a mechanical precision, never looking at him for longer than a second. Ethan gave her space. She had earned that. But on the 4th day, when she came by to gather a box of documents, he finally spoke. "I'm not leaving." Emily didn't even look up. "I don't care." Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching as she shuffled through papers. "Yes, you do." She slammed a folder shut, exhaling sharply. "Ethan, what do you want from me?" He hesitated. "A chance." Emily let out a bitter laugh, rubbing her temple. "A chance to what? Make yourself feel better?" "No. A chance to be your brother again." That made her pause. Ethan pushed forward before she could shut him down. "I know I can't undo the past. I know I don't deserve an easy fix. But I also know that you and Mom were the only family I ever had. And now," he swallowed hard, "now it's just us." Emily's fingers tightened around the stack of papers she was holding. "You don't get to say that like it's some revelation, Ethan. I've known that for years." "I've been living it," Ethan nodded, taking a step closer. "Then let me start living it too." Emily stared at him for a long moment. She looked exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. She sighed, pressing her fingers against her forehead. "You really aren't leaving?" Ethan shook his head. "No." A long silence. Then, finally, Emily exhaled, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she was about to say. "Fine. But if you're staying, you're not just sitting around feeling sorry for yourself." Ethan smirked slightly. "So what? You're putting me to work." Emily picked up a pile of envelopes and shoved them into his chest. "Yeah, you can start with the bills." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head as he looked down at the mess of paperwork. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. Ethan adjusted slowly to life back home. It wasn't easy. The silence in the house was the worst part. He was used to noise, the hum of aircraft engines, the distant echo of orders being shouted, the steady rhythm of boots hitting metal decks. Here, there was nothing. Just the occasional creak of the floorboards, the ticking of an old clock in the living room, the distant hum of cars passing by outside. It felt wrong, like he was living in someone else's life. But for the first time in years, he didn't run from it. Instead, he did what he could to keep busy. He fixed the loose cabinet door in the kitchen, mowed the lawn that had grown too wild, took his mother's old car to get serviced, even though no one would be driving it anytime soon. Emily didn't say much about it, but she noticed. One afternoon, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table sorting through his mother's bills, Emily walked in, dropping a yellow folder in front of him. "You need a job." Ethan blinked, glancing at the folder. "Good morning to you too." Emily ignored his sarcasm and pulled out a chair, sitting across from him. "I talked to a guy I know. He's a fire captain here in town. They're looking for people. Thought it might be a good fit." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You're signing me up to run into burning buildings now?" Emily crossed her arms. "You spent 10 years in war zones. Pretty sure you can handle a fire hose." Ethan smirked, flipping open the folder. Inside was an application for the Charleston Fire Department, along with a handwritten note from someone named Captain Ross, saying he'd be willing to meet with Ethan next week. Ethan stared at it for a moment, running his thumb along the edge of the paper. A normal job, a civilian job, the idea felt foreign, but at the same time, it didn't feel wrong. Ethan exhaled, glancing up at Emily. "You really think I should do this?" Emily shrugged. "I think you need something to do, and I think—" She hesitated, then sighed. "I think you're not the type to sit still for long." Ethan chuckled, that obvious. Painfully, she stood, grabbing her coffee mug. "Just think about it." Ethan nodded, looking back down at the papers. For the first time since coming home, he didn't feel like he was just waiting for time to pass. Maybe this was something. Maybe this was a way forward. Ethan did think about it. For 2 days, he stared at the application, reading and rereading every question like the words might suddenly change. It wasn't the job that scared him. It was what it meant, choosing to stay, choosing to build something here, choosing to stop running. But Emily was right about one thing. He couldn't sit still. So on Monday morning, he got in his truck, drove across town, and walked into Station 14 of the Charleston Fire Department. The place smelled like smoke, sweat, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. A few firefighters were gathered near the trucks, laughing about something, their uniforms half-buttoned, relaxed but ready. It reminded him too much of the Navy, and maybe that was why he didn't turn around and leave. A stocky man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of presence that made people straighten up when he walked into a room, stepped forward. "You must be Walker." Ethan nodded. "Captain Ross?" The older man studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. "Let's talk." The office was small but cluttered, stacks of reports. An old coffee mug with the words, "World's Okayest Firefighter" printed on it, and a bulletin board filled with news clippings. Ross sat behind the desk and motioned for Ethan to take a seat. "Your sister said you were looking for a fresh start." Ethan smirked. "My sister said a lot of things." Ross chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Well, I'll be straight with you, Walker. We're short on guys. Training takes time, but military vets tend to do well here. You know how to handle pressure, how to work as a team, and how to follow orders without whining about it." "That's a good start," Ethan nodded. "I can handle pressure." Ross raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. Ever run into a burning building?" Ethan's smirk faded. "No, but I've run into worse." Ross studied him again, then gave a slow nod. "Fair enough." He pulled out a stack of forms and slid them across the desk. "Fill these out. Physical test is next week. If you pass that, we'll see what you're made of." Ethan picked up the pen. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making a decision that mattered. Not for his country, not for a mission, for himself. Ethan didn't tell Emily right away. He filled out the forms, signed his name on the dotted lines, and scheduled the physical test for the following week. But he didn't bring it up at dinner, didn't mention it when she stopped by the house to check on things. Maybe part of him was afraid he'd fail. Or maybe part of him just wanted to prove to himself that he was actually going to follow through this time. The morning of the test, he stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. The scars, the lines on his face, the weight of 10 years still sitting heavy on his shoulders. He had been in the best shape of his life in the Navy, but this was different. Fires didn't care about rank, about experience. They didn't care how many years you'd served. They burned through everything just the same. He ran a hand over his jaw, exhaled sharply, then grabbed his keys and headed out. Time to see if he could do this. The Charleston Fire Department's training facility was nothing like the bases Ethan had trained on during his Navy years, but the intensity was the same. 12 candidates stood in a line, some younger, some older, all of them trying to prove they had what it took. Captain Ross was waiting, arms crossed as he paced in front of them. All right, listen up. Today's test is simple. You either pass or you don't. If you don't, you can try again in 6 months. But if you want to be here, if you want to be part of this team, then you need to prove it today. Ethan's jaw tightened. There was no second chance for him. Not with this, not with Emily, not with himself. The test was brutal. Dragging a 200-pound dummy out of a simulated fire, running up 5 flights of stairs in full gear, crawling through a smoke-filled tunnel with zero visibility, hauling hoses, forcing open doors, carrying equipment that felt like it doubled in weight with every step. Ethan pushed through each task, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning. He reminded himself this wasn't combat, no bullets, no enemy waiting in the dark, just the fire, and the fire didn't care about his past. By the time he finished the last drill, his shirt was soaked in sweat, his arms shaking from exhaustion. He ripped off his helmet, taking a deep breath as he staggered upright. Ross walked over, clipboard in hand. Not bad, Walker. Ethan wiped a hand across his face. Did I pass? Ross let the silence drag for a second before smirking. See you Monday morning? Ethan nodded, his heart still hammering. He had done it. For the first time in years, he had taken a step towards something real, and this time he wasn't turning back. Ethan waited 2 days before telling Emily, not because he was unsure, but because, for the first time in years, he wanted to show her he could follow through before making promises. She came by the house Wednesday evening, like she had been doing since their mother's funeral. She didn't stay long, just long enough to check the mail, make sure he hadn't let the place fall apart. Ethan was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter when she walked in. I passed the test. Emily stopped mid-step, frowning. What test? He set his coffee mug down. The one for the fire department. She blinked, caught off guard. Wait, you actually did it? Ethan smirked. You sound surprised. Emily scoffed, setting her purse on the table. You've been back for weeks, Ethan, and this is the first real decision you've made. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I know. Emily crossed her arms, studying him. So, this isn't just something to pass the time? No, I start Monday. A beat of silence. Then, to his surprise, Emily smiled. Good. It was a small word, but it meant more than she probably realized. Ethan nodded. Good. For the first time in a long time, something between them felt different. Not fixed, but maybe getting there. Monday morning came fast. Ethan arrived at Station 14 at sunrise, his nerves unexpectedly on edge. He had been through deployments, combat zones, hellish training, but this was new. Inside, the station was already buzzing with movement, gear being checked, equipment being cleaned, guys swapping stories over stale coffee. It was familiar and foreign all at once. Captain Ross spotted him near the lockers. Walker, Ethan straightened instinctively. Sir, Ross smirked. Drop the sir. You're not in the Navy anymore. Ethan relaxed slightly. Ross clapped a hand on his shoulder. You made it through the test. That's the easy part. The real work starts now. Ethan nodded. I'm ready. Ross gave him a knowing look. We'll see. The first 2 weeks were a blur. Ethan spent hours learning the layout of the trucks, memorizing protocols, practicing drills until his muscles ached. But the job wasn't just physical, it was mental. emotional. His first real fire came on a Thursday night, a house fire on the east side of town. Nothing could have prepared him for the moment he stepped into that burning building, the suffocating heat, the thick black smoke, the way fire seemed to move like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. His training kicked in. He moved fast, focused, crawled through blinding smoke, followed the sound of a child crying, found a little girl trapped in a bedroom closet. She was 5 years old, terrified. Ethan carried her out, feeling the weight of her small body against his chest. When they got outside, her mother was waiting, sobbing, collapsing to her knees, holding her daughter like she'd never let go. Ethan stood there, watching. And for the first time since coming home, he felt something shift inside him. For years, his life had been about leaving. But here, now, standing on the wet pavement, watching a mother hold her child, knowing that he had helped save them, he finally understood. Maybe he had spent years running, but this was worth staying for. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Even after he got back from the call, even after he showered off the smoke, sweat and adrenaline, his mind refused to slow down. He kept seeing the little girl's face, the way she had clung to him, her tiny hands gripping his gear so tightly it was like she thought he might disappear if she let go. He had spent years in war zones, pulling men out of burning wreckage, dragging wounded soldiers to safety. But this was different. This wasn't war. This was home. And that terrified him more than anything. Emily noticed something was off the next time they had dinner. They had started meeting up once a week, not because they talked about it, not because they said things were fixed, but because somehow it just happened. She set down her fork, eyes narrowing slightly. "You good?" Ethan looked up from his barely touched plate. "Yeah." "Why?" Emily gave him a look. "Because you just spent the last 5 minutes staring at your food like it personally offended you." Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Had a rough call last night." Emily leaned back in her chair. "First one?" Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "First one that felt different." Emily was quiet for a moment, then softer. "What happened?" Ethan thought about lying, saying it was nothing, just part of the job. But something in Emily's expression told him she actually wanted to know. So he told her, not just about the fire, not just about the little girl, but about what it meant, what it changed, about how, for the first time, he wasn't running towards something new. He was staying. Emily listened, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "Sounds like you finally figured it out." Ethan tilted his head. "Figured what out?" Emily gave him a small, knowing smile. "Why Mom never left this town." Ethan stared at her, and just like that, he understood. Part 18. Ethan didn't know what to say, because Emily was right. For years, he had never understood why their mother had stayed in Charleston, in the same house, in the same life, never once trying to leave. Now he did. She had found something worth staying for, and for the first time in his life, so had he. The next few weeks at the firehouse were grueling. Ethan had passed the test, but that didn't mean he was one of them yet. He was still the new guy, still had to prove himself every single day. He ran drills until his muscles ached, cleaned equipment, checked oxygen tanks, learned how to function as part of this team, a team that wasn't military, wasn't bound by rank, but was still something real. And then there were the calls. Some nights were quiet, false alarms, minor accidents. Other nights weren't, fires that swallowed houses in minutes, car wrecks that turned highways into war zones, calls where they arrived too late. Ethan didn't say much after those nights, but Emily noticed. One evening, after another long shift, he found himself at her apartment. He didn't even remember driving there. Emily opened the door, took one look at his face, and didn't ask questions. Instead, she just stepped aside and let him in. They sat in silence for a while. Ethan stared at the floor, elbows resting on his knees. Emily sat across from him, sipping a beer, waiting. Eventually, he spoke. "I lost someone today." Emily exhaled slowly. "A fire?" Ethan nodded. "We did everything right. We got there fast, followed protocol, did everything we were supposed to do." He clenched his jaw. Still wasn't enough. Emily studied him for a long moment, then quietly. "And what would you have done in the Navy?" Ethan frowned. "What? If you lost someone over there, what would you have done?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Because he knew. He would have buried it, moved on, told himself there wasn't time to grieve. That's what the job demanded. But here, he let out a breath. "I don't know." Emily set down her beer. "Well, maybe now's the time to figure it out." Ethan didn't know how, but for the first time he was willing to try. Ethan didn't figure it out overnight, but he didn't push it down either. That was new. Instead of drowning himself in distractions, he let the weight of the job sit with him. The losses, the victories, the helplessness of knowing that no matter how hard he fought, sometimes it wouldn't be enough. But sometimes it would. And that had to be enough. A month passed. Then, too, Emily was still cautious with him, not cold, not angry, just waiting, watching, as if she was still trying to decide if he was really here to stay or if he'd disappear the second things got too real. Ethan didn't blame her, so he kept showing up. For work, for her, for himself. One afternoon, he stopped by their mother's house. His house now. Emily was already there, sorting through boxes in the living room. She had been handling everything since the funeral, piece by piece. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "You didn't have to do all this alone." Emily looked up, raising an eyebrow. "You were busy." There was no bitterness in her voice, just fact. Still, Ethan shook his head. Not an excuse. Emily studied him for a second. Then she sighed and pushed a cardboard box toward him. "Fine, you can help." Ethan smirked. "See? Progress." Emily rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Maybe for the first time in years, they were getting somewhere. Later that night, as they packed away the last of their mother's things, Ethan found an old envelope tucked inside a drawer. It had his name on it, in their mother's handwriting. His breath caught. Emily saw his expression and frowned. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated. Then, slowly, he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. And as he unfolded the paper, his mother's words hit him like a tidal wave. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means you finally came home." Ethan swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the paper. Emily didn't say anything. She just sat beside him, and for the first time, Ethan felt ready to hear what his mother had to say. Ethan's hands felt too heavy as he unfolded the letter. His mother's handwriting was just as he remembered, neat, deliberate, careful. He ran his fingers over the ink, his chest tightening as he forced himself to breathe. Emily stayed quiet beside him, her presence steady. She didn't push, didn't ask if he was okay, she just waited. And somehow that made it easier. Finally, he started to read. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And it means you finally came home." His throat tightened. "I know you, my boy. I know how you carry things. I know how you bury them. And I know you think you failed me by not being here. But listen to me, Ethan. You didn't." His grip on the paper trembled. Because that was wrong. He had failed her. He should have been there, should have answered more calls, should have come home sooner. But the letter continued. "I never wanted you to be trapped here. I never wanted you to stay out of guilt or obligation. You left because you had to, because you had a purpose bigger than this small town. And I was proud of you every single day, even when you thought I wasn't." Ethan exhaled shakily, rubbing his hand over his face. Proud. She had been proud of him even after everything. Emily shifted beside him, her voice softer than usual. "What else does it say?" Ethan swallowed hard and kept reading. But Ethan, there's one thing I need you to understand. You can't keep running forever. Life isn't just about duty. It's about the people who make it worth living. And you still have that, my love. You still have Emily. And I need you to promise me right now that you won't let her carry everything alone anymore. His breath hitched. He turned to Emily, but she was already looking at him. Her eyes were glassy, filled with something he hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not resentment, just hope. She reached for the letter, her fingers brushing against his for half a second before she took it and read the last few lines out loud. Be there for her, and let her be there for you. That's all I ever wanted. Silence. Ethan blinked rapidly, clenching his jaw to keep himself together. Emily let out a breath and folded the letter carefully, holding it in her lap like something fragile. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. She never doubted you, you know. Ethan ran a hand over his face. Maybe she should have. Emily shook her head. She knew you'd come back. Ethan stared at her. Then, for the first time in years, he let himself believe it. And for the first time in his life, he let himself forgive. Ethan sat in silence for a long time, staring at the letter in Emily's hands. He had spent years carrying regret like armor, convinced that if he let go of it, even for a second, he would be admitting that everything he had done, all the sacrifices, had been for nothing. But his mother's words were a gift he had been too late to receive in person, a gift that was here anyway. Emily didn't rush him. She didn't press for words or demand some grand emotional breakthrough. Instead, she simply sat beside him, like family, like she had always been. And for the first time, Ethan let himself believe that he hadn't lost everything. He still had this. He still had her. The next morning, Ethan woke up feeling lighter. The grief was still there. He knew it always would be. But for the first time since coming home, it didn't feel like a weight dragging him under. Instead, it felt like a part of him, something he could carry without letting it break him. Emily showed up at the house later that day. She knocked once before stepping inside, a habit from when they were kids. Hey, Ethan looked up from the small stack of belongings he had been sorting through. Hey, she nodded toward the open box at his feet. You finally cleaning this place up? Ethan smirked. Figured it was time. Emily crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. You sticking around then? There was no challenge in her voice, no doubt, just a simple question, a real one. Ethan held her gaze and nodded. Yeah. Emily exhaled slowly, then smiled. A small, real smile. Good. Life didn't magically fix itself overnight. Ethan still had hard days at the firehouse. There were still calls that left him staring at the ceiling for hours afterward, still moments where he questioned if he was really meant for this life. But then there were the days that reminded him why he stayed. Like the day he got his first official badge, and Emily showed up to the station with a smirk and a sarcastic, "Look at you, all official and everything." Or the day he saved a man from a burning apartment and felt the same certainty in his chest that he had felt in the Navy, the certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And then there were the quiet days, the ones where Emily invited him over for dinner without an excuse, the ones where he sat on his mother's old porch, drinking coffee, listening to the sounds of a town that finally felt like home again. The ones where he didn't feel like he was waiting for something else. Because for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't waiting for the next deployment. He wasn't running toward the next mission. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was home. And this time, he was staying. For good. The end. This is the final part of Ethan's journey. He started as a man drowning in regret, running from his past, and ended as someone who finally learned to stay, to let go of guilt, rebuild his relationship with Emily, and find a new purpose outside the military. Let me know if you want any adjustments or expansions. I hope this ending captures the emotional weight you were looking for. 5 years later, the sound of sirens echoed through the streets of Charleston, but Ethan barely noticed them anymore. Not because he didn't care, he cared more than ever. But after 5 years as a firefighter, the blaring alarms, the rush of adrenaline, the sharp focus that came with a call, all of it had become part of him. Just like this town, just like this life. He pulled the fire engine into the station's garage, parking it in its usual spot. The rest of the crew climbed out, stretching tired muscles, shaking off the weight of another long shift. Ethan glanced at the clock. 6:17 a.m. Right on time. Captain Ross, now a little grayer, gave him a nod as he passed. "Good work last night, Walker." Ethan smirked. "Getting soft on me, Cap." Ross scoffed. "Shut up and go home." Ethan chuckled, tossing his helmet onto the rack before heading to his truck. Home. 5 years ago, that word had meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. The house looked different. Gone were the cluttered boxes, the dust-covered furniture, the untouched reminders of the past. It was still his mother's home, but now it was his too. He pulled into the driveway, stepping out just as the front door swung open. Emily stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, shaking her head. "You look like hell," Ethan grinned, rubbing a hand over his face. "Thanks. You really know how to make a guy feel welcome." Emily rolled her eyes but stepped aside to let him in. 5 years ago, they had barely been speaking. Now, this was routine. She poured him a cup of coffee, black, just the way their mother used to make it, and sat across from him at the kitchen table. Ethan took a sip and exhaled, feeling the weight of exhaustion, but also the peace that had taken years to build. Emily tilted her head. "You ever think about how different things are?" Ethan smirked. "Every damn day." She nodded, staring down at her mug. "Mom would be proud, you know." Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't flinch at the mention of her anymore. Instead, he just smiled. "Yeah, I think so too." For the first time in years, he wasn't just existing, he was living. And for the first time, he wasn't waiting for the next thing to take him away. He was home. For good. Final ending. This is the official time jump conclusion. Ethan fully settled into his new life. His relationship with Emily healed, and his journey from running to belonging finally complete. Let me know if you want anything more, a deeper dive into his personal life, a final challenge to overcome, or a completely different angle. Hope this ending feels satisfying.